Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar brought to you by sharedserviceslink and sponsored by Vertex. Today, we are going to be looking at building a roadmap for tax transformation. My name is Sarah Fain, and I am the head of content at sharedserviceslink, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our panel of experts. We have Jenny Fisk, the head of tax infrastructure at Maersk, Peter Borhoff, the VAT Director CTO at Vertex, and Roger Lindelau, the Director of SAP Center of Excellence at Vertex. You, of course, have a very important role to play in today's webinar as well, and that is to make sure that you get the most out of this hour. This is quite an interactive session. We'll be going back and forth between the panelists, but we also be looking at the questions throughout the webinar as well. So if there's anything that's super relevant, we'll be keeping an eye on them and we can answer them as they come up. And anything more specific, we can address in about the last 10 or 15 minutes of the webinar. So please do put your questions into us. The best way to do that is using the question functionality, which is usually over on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you submit your text-based questions to us, again, we'll take them either during the webinar or at the end. You will get a copy of the slides. This is very interactive, so the recording may be more helpful. Everybody will be sent the slides and they're available on our site. And this afternoon, the recording should be available on sharespace.digital. We also have a few little extra bonuses for you. We know your time is precious and you have a lot of webinars in the calendar. So we are giving away an Apple Watch to a lucky listener. The qualifications is you must be a tax or a finance professional who attends the entire webinar. So please do stay on for the whole time. We'll be looking at the timestamps and doing a giveaway next week, I believe. And we are also now a CPD certified partner. So we will be sending the timestamps to CPD. So if you're collecting these credits, you should receive a certificate within 28 days of the webinar. So let's just touch a little bit of context and why we're here for today. So the changes in indirect tax, to no surprise to anybody on the line, are happening at an unprecedented pace. And this really isn't business as usual. It's not something that we think that traditional tax departments and traditional setups can really handle on their own. Hence the calls for finance transformation and tax transformation. If you're struggling with any of this, you're not alone, and you are in the right place today. And we are going to be sharing some of the best practices and what some of the things that leading companies are doing to put indirect tax front and center of their company's finance transformation. But we're finding not everyone has had a seat at the table yet, so we're going to be exploring what this journey looks like. So just to give you a little bit of sense of what we're going to be discussing today, we are going to be looking at how to get a seat at the table. What are some of the must-haves and nice-to-haves when it comes to tax transformation? Whether or not there actually is such a thing as a best-in-class VAT function, and what should be in the toolbox of indirect tax teams. But first, I thought it might just be good to take a moment to actually understand what we mean by tax transformation. So Peter and Jenny, can I just bring in you here to take your take on this?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And that's a very valid question to basically explore first of all, okay, what do we see as tax transformation? And from my perspective, it's basically a move from, let's say, a really tax legal way of working to more of embedding and optimizing tax relevant processes, data and systems in line with the overall business structure, and of course also the IT capabilities of an organization. And as such, as a result of my perception at least of tax transformation, it's not also only limited to what the core tax team does, but it also extends across other disciplines like, for example, finance operations, outsourcing partners sometimes, or even the IT department. And you already mentioned a finance transformation, and based on my experience, let's say if a business engages or initiates a finance transformation, this is quite often also a trigger to look at and what's in it for tax. But I'm also curious to know, well, okay, Jenny's perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well, I actually would echo a lot of what you've said. It really is about what change do you need to drive in order to meet both your potential business changing goals, but also to respond to external change. So, it's about taking a look at your tax function and how you deliver tax and what you need to deliver, and asking yourself, well, is that going to meet what I need to do in the future and what my organization needs? And therefore, what do I need to change? What sort of real things do I need to drive? So it's not just about making incremental improvements, although that some of those things may be there, but actually taking a step back and thinking, when I consider across all aspects of what I'm doing as a tax function, both the people, the skill sets needed, the organizational structure, as well as the processes, the data, the systems, what is needed to really make myself fit for the future, and not just to sort of carry on. So it can be a bit of a buzzword, but it is really, to me, it's about thinking about the real changes that you need to be more future proofed and able to cope with what's coming at you externally, and how that can then support your business goals.
Well, thanks so much for that input. So before we kind of launch into a bit more on this, we actually want to hear from people on the line as well. So when it comes to tax transformation, what do you actually see as the most important trigger for these changes that come with the tax transformation? So unfortunately, you can only pick one here, so you have to pick the top one that you think is most important. Do you think it's things like external, non-regulatory changes, events like COVID? Do you think it's tax regulatory developments, for example, e-invoicing or the country by country reporting that we're seeing? Do you think it's things like supply chain and business model changes which are triggering tax transformation? Do you see that it's finance or restructuring processes, for example, moving to a shared services or outsourcing that's triggering tax transformation? Or is it things like the IT landscape, for example, ERP integrations or S/4HANA rollouts, triggering tax transformation? So I appreciate there may be more than one, but we're asking you to choose the most important. So great to see lots of you voting. And we've got about 70% of you voting, so I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and the results will be coming up on your screen now. So 3 ones here kind of stand out as what you think. So 31% of you say it's things like tax regulatory developments. So for example, the country by country reporting, and that's tied in first place by finance restructuring. So for example, moving to a shared services center. In second place, it's things like the IT landscape or ERP integrations or S/4HANA. And then kind of tied in last place are, external triggering events like COVID or supply chain and business model changes. So thanks for your input there. So interesting to see your thoughts on that. And with that, we would like to turn back to the panel. I'll start with Jenny about what do you think it actually takes to get a seat at the table in these transformation programs?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Well, it's very interesting, and I was very intrigued to see how people were responding to those polling questions, because I think how you get a seat at the table actually relates to, what are the key triggers from your perspective and your organization's perspective. And I know from my own experience, took a long time to get what I would consider to be sufficient traction from a tax perspective into both our sort of wider business transformation and more specifically the finance and tax transformation. And I think one of the things that really I've come to realize, and it might seem obvious, is that actually you need to stop thinking like a tax person and stop doing the there's a legal requirement, or even license to operate, which that can grab people's attention and is great, but actually you get more positive reaction by changing your your reasons for being involved to the more sort of frontline business goals. So thinking about, well, if I've got a goal or an ambition around customer interaction and customer, how customers see us and so on, how can the tax aspects relate to that? So, can I improve the position around disputes on invoices, for example? So really thinking about how do you line up to the wider business goals and business value, and along with that, I think bringing hard data. So it's quite difficult often in tax to be very specific, and I think you often kind of fall back on, well, there's a legal requirement, or we'll get lots of tax audits, or we won't be able to operate. But actually, if you can put some numbers around that, that makes it a lot easier, particularly for finance people who just love data. So I think that's important. And the other thing I would say is, from my experience, is kind of you've got to kiss a lot of frogs. So you need to speak to lots and lots of people, and take all the opportunities you can to get doors opened for you. Identify people who can help you, who can help advocate. Make sure that your leaders are properly briefed. And a good piece of advice I was given a couple of years ago was be patient. Just because you're passionate about it and you're kind of several leaps ahead, remember that most of the people you're talking to are still way back. So you've got to be prepared to go over what might seem like the same thing over and over again with lots of different people, to get people engaged and bring them up to speed. So I guess, persistence and a positive outlook, to my mind, really critical. So Peter, what are your thoughts?
Peter, you're on mute.
Yeah, if you move to the next slide, Sarah, then we can also have a look at the triggering events, because there's like Jenny already said, it was a lot of valuable information, and I can completely agree with that. There's a couple of different angles. For example, if you say, well, okay, if there are external events or tax legal developments that are relevant now or in the future, you basically need to sell those to your organization. And if you look at, let's say, the IT development, supply chain, or finance restructuring, those are internal business developments, from which a tax department or a tax organization, I should actually say, can also benefit. So it's important, from my perspective, that as, let's say, the tax strategy group, you know where your business is heading, you know where tax legislation and processes are heading. So what is tax administrations expecting? And based on that, determine what you need now, determine what is basically already lacking based on processes and systems, and also determine kind of a tax strategy or a vision, also with respect to your business data. And then, like Jenny already said, start talking to a lot of people and really build your alliances, and not only with the traditional finance people, but also with IT, with supply chain, with legal, with your customs colleagues, to make sure that you identify relevant projects that you can also use to improve, let's say, your resulting tax projects. And that also implies that as a tax person, a core tax person, I'm also a core tax person, you should actually step away quite often, maybe even uncomfortably often. You have to step away from your legal advisor role and really start thinking into business and finance processes, and understand, well, okay, what's actually happening from that perspective, and help the company move forward, and at the same time, grab the opportunities to improve your tax processes. But it's really about building alliances.
Peter and Jenny, you seem to be very advanced already in taking a seat at the table if it comes to changing the tax function, especially in ERP systems. You already notice that you need to be on the table to actually make a change in that process. If I take that a little bit back, I think 10 years ago, I'm not sure if you also were already aware that you had to take a seat at the table. Is that correct? Were you 10 years ago also already so advanced that you said, I need to be at that table? Or was it a little bit different?
I guess for me, because my background has been in this area, I probably would have seen that. But I think the reality is that tax in many organisations just wasn't. And I think in my own organisation, when I first joined it, that was the biggest challenge was actually getting people to listen.
Yeah.
From my perspective, Roger, the tax department traditionally is very closely linked to finance, to what controllers do and what the CFO wants, and quite often is less involved, and especially less involved in the IT department, because they just need to produce and provide you with the laptop or desktop computer to do your work. That's IT.
Yeah, that's correct, and that is why I came back to the past, and I saw that very often. And my question is more like, why do you need to have a seat at the table? And I see a lot of VT managers are still not at the point that they understand why they need to be at that table. So we are talking about how to get at that table, but I would like to take that back to why do you need to be at the table? If you look at for example, an ERP system like SAP, very often you have the misunderstanding that, yeah, it's an expensive ERP system. We do a lot of investments. So VT probably is handled correctly in those systems. It can't be that you spend so much money and VT is then not handled correctly in those systems. So what you very often saw also in the past, if you are buying or upgrading an SAP system, then the VT managers sometimes were asked, like, do you also have requirements for VT? And they would say, yes, that needs to be automated, etc., etc. Then it was just a point on a checklist in a project to see if SAP was actually handling VT. And then, of course, the answer was yes, SAP will handle VT, but nobody told you that there were gaps and that there was a lot of missing functionality in the SAP system to automate actually also complex VT flows. And that you also now see with the upgrades to S/4HANA. So very often you see even a new implementation of S/4HANA, learning from the past. Also there, I would say VT managers actually need to get a seat at the table, because also in the S/4HANA systems, VT actually has not changed really. So you still need to have a seat at the table to really point out that VT is really important in your organization, and that you really need to have a right vision on how VT should be handled also in the S/4HANA systems. So I would take it more to the why instead of how to get there.
Well, thanks all. I think these are all really interesting points and kind of a wide variety of views there. So let's say you are able to get a seat at the table, and hopefully you are for those very important reasons. I'd like to ask our panelists, what do you think are your must-haves, and maybe what are some of the things is be nice to have. We appreciate that you probably won't get everything, and everybody's journey is going to look very different. So this won't necessarily give the listeners a blueprint. But Jenny, I'd like to turn to you first and just ask, what do you think is the must-to-have when you get to the table? What to be asking for?
Yeah, which is a really good question, because that there are so many things that you could do, and if you look across the business life cycle or the tax life cycle, inevitably you'll see lots of things, and you'll have a lot of pain areas that you experience in tax, and often you see things around your tax returns, and perhaps around the level of tax audits that you get, and the challenges that you have in addressing those. And it is actually quite tempting to say, well, those are at the end of the process that I can influence myself, or I can do something about that without having to involve too many other people. but I think, you know, without sort of giving a list of specific things, what we've done is say, well, those things are a result of things that happen upstream, whether that's upstream in finance or actually in the commercial organization. So for me, addressing it, and it's harder because you don't control those areas. You've got to really work hard to influence and get your views and your inputs in there into things that other people own. But I think from a must-have perspective, we focus very much on what do, you know, a must-have for us is what do I do about getting you know, for example, master data set up right from a tax perspective. What can I do about ensuring that I get the correct tax determination or treatment at the time of transaction, and putting our efforts there. Not to say we're ignoring the last mile end, because we're not, but you know, fundamentally, if you're focusing on automating or sorting out your VAT return end without addressing the rest of it, all you're going to do is maybe, you know, get rubbish through faster. So so I think actually taking a step back and thinking what almost like peeling away the onion, what really matters and what's going to have an absolutely fundamental impact on our outcomes, and going there. So that's one thing. And I guess the other thing that I would consider in the sort of must-have versus nice-to-have, and, you know, how do I prioritize my list, is thinking about the future. You might not be able to get where you want to go in one step, but you know, and it might be that you have to take you know, steps along the way. But if you can try to think about how do you minimize the amount of technical debt you're creating or regret cost in building things, that can help you determine whether something really is a must-have. You know, do I really need to fix this issue now, or actually is there something I can do to maybe work around it and slightly improve it, but I want to put more of my effort into how do I fix this strategically and longer term, which, yeah, is painful and might not realize value quite so quickly, but overall, is it going to give me a better you know, better outcome?
Jenny, I thought it was really important what you mentioned, that you're concentrating also on the master data and the determination of the tax treatments. I see that very often with companies. I talk a lot with different companies, that they are concentrating on the reporting, trying to fix the errors in the reporting instead of going back to the root causes, and spend a lot of money in the reporting process, and all that money that is spent there is basically to just fix reports, but not fixing the root causes. And then they keep on fixing problems constantly in the reporting, where I say the money would be better spent probably to first look into your master data and your tax determination processes, get your data right, and then you have a far easier reporting process in the end. So I think that was a really important point to make there.
Yeah, can I chime in on that, because that's so true. That people are focusing on reporting, and especially if you look at indirect tax, and that's usually also, let's say, the easy part, because that's relatively visible. And but moving from what is visible, being your VAT report and maybe the underlying data, and moving to really your master data and fixing that, I would also, and that would be part of my must-have, is I would also want very, let's say, detailed insights of what is happening in all of your ERP systems and processes across the globe, so that you can really identify the issues in a structured manner, rather than running based on incidents because you see an incidental invoice or react on an incidental question, but really understand, well, okay, I now have this issue, but is this really the top priority issue, or is it number 11 on your list of 10 that you can deal with? And for that, you really need those insights.
Yeah, agree.
That's great. And yeah, Peter, would you be able to maybe just give us a bit more insight on kind of taking back control and some of the landscape here that we've set out?
Yeah, you mentioned in the beginning, and we touched upon that, finance transformation, and as a result, tax transformation. And if there's anything such as, for example, an end-to-end VAT report or a process, I'm trying to reflect that on this slide. But it's basically, if you identify the end-to-end VAT report, it's scattered across purchase to pay, order to cash, record to report that Roger already mentioned, producing your VAT reports. But of course, all these processes are also impacted by basically your master data and the quality of your master data. And when looking at this process, the traditional tax control framework, or a traditional tax control framework, is quite often built around, let's say, a decentralized finance function, having all of this in one country, sometimes even one legal entity. So finance operations, tax accounting are all done by, let's say, the same kind of people, likely sitting at the same desk. And when you move to kind of shared service center environment, you basically tear all those functions apart. So your AP may be sitting in India, your IT department may be sitting partly in India, partly in your legal entity. Your sourcing may be in the US, for example. And if you then still have a tax control framework managed based on having it all in one country, yeah, you miss quite a lot of, let's say, information, and you're no longer in control. So when you're moving to, let's say, a decentralized, or when you're moving to a centralized world with shared service centers, IT located elsewhere, you also need to look at, well, okay, how do I take back control? How do I connect the dots again from a VAT process perspective? And when you move to, for example, shared service centers, you lose a lot of specific organizational benefits, but you also win a few. And the key things that you will lose is, for example, business knowledge and proximity to day-to-day business activities. And also you lose proximity to legislative tax developments. And this is also partly impacted by language challenges, because if you move to a shared service center, it's very difficult to build global language skills in that shared service center unless you are a really large organization that can build a large shared service center. But you will also benefit. You will benefit from standard processes. You will benefit from more centralized controls and centralized insights. And you can also benefit from centralized knowledge. It's no longer let's say, a financial person having to have financial knowledge and corporate income tax knowledge and indirect tax knowledge, but you can really concentrate that with a few people, for example, in your shared service center. But one of the challenging things also is that you will then also have to manage your ERP landscape centrally. And you need to stay up to date with global tax developments. And in a decentralized environment, that's quite often done by your country organization. But in a centralized environment, you need to manage that, for example, as an HQ tax manager. And you need to be aware of those changes, and you need to be ensure that they are properly embedded in your ERP landscape. And yeah, the question and the challenge is, well, okay, how do you ensure, as, let's say, an HQ tax manager or an HQ indirect tax manager, how do you stay in the middle of these ERP changes across the globe? And yeah, I'm curious to see if Roger and Jenny have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, interesting listening to you there, Peter, because I was just, while you were speaking, I was reflecting on some of the things that we've done as an organisation. And I think, you know, one of the critical things is taking a step back and saying, actually, if I look at my business, where does tax risk arise, or what is causing it, and therefore where do I need to focus control? So shifting from the or what controls do I have in my you know, my reporting type of processes, but where else are things going, or could things go wrong? And for example, looking at the IT maintenance and management processes and thinking, well, actually, if we have automation around tax determination or around how things are booked to various GL accounts, how do I make sure, have I got anything in there that makes sure that as a tax function I'm consulted, or I've got the right sort of level of tax control? So actually thinking about where you should have control in processes outside of tax. So, you know, for example, having people having the ability to make changes to the tax configuration logic or your tax engine without you know, the approval of the tax function, to me is a no-no. But it can be quite surprising how much things like that can go on, which don't come anywhere near tax. And similarly, you know, changing in changes to master data, or failure to include data points that you need in your master data setup. So taking a real step back and thinking, well, where are the risks arising? How can I get them controlled? And where is the best point to get them controlled? Because, you know, if you think about the increase in digital compliance, and the fact that more and more tax authorities know more about our data before we even do often, you know, you've got to think about the getting it right first time. It's too late to wait for processes and controls around your reporting cycles and trying to fix things then, which is, you know, it's sort of the old way of doing things. So you've really got to sort of shift your mindset, and the challenge there, I think, is getting other people along with you, you know, because sometimes people within tax will say, well, I can't control everything that happens in the business, or people, you know, I don't want to own another process. And you say, well, it's not about owning that process, it's about getting the right you know, the right tax considerations brought into there. It's not about turning the whole of your organization into tax people, because that's not going to happen. But how do I bring in control in a preferably preventative and automated way into those things that are happening upstream? And you know, it's difficult, but if you don't start addressing that, you're really never going to be fit for purpose in the new world.
Yeah, and that control is, I think, very important. And if you look at an IT organization, also worked in those organizations, you very often see if there's an issue with VT, there's just a change request created for the IT organization. IT will look at it, don't inform anybody from the VT department, just think that the business knows what the VT treatment should be, and then work on it from an IT angle, and then try to get a solution in there without the VT manager even knowing that there was an issue and how it is being solved. If we then take the IT angle, and maybe we look at another slide now to look at the SAP VT determination struggle. What are we actually struggling in an SAP system, for example? I've drawn a picture here, and I started really a long time ago in 1980 when SAP was basically designed. They also in the 80s designed their VT determination solution. And that VT determination solution, that is that blue box, what I've drawn on the slide, you see that hardly ever changes. So we're now in 2021, almost in 2022 already, and you see the VT determination solution in the SAP system is basically still the same as we looked at it 40 years ago. But you see that the VT requirements in the meantime have really increased in complexity. You see that we are getting increased complexity and speed in e-invoicing, e-filing, e-audits, etc., etc. You see that SAP is owning now far more systems. You see an S/4HANA system. You see that SAP is also owning now an SAP Ariba system. They have a Concur. They also are in the e-commerce cloud. But if you then look at how this all needs to be changed in all those systems, then SAP says, yeah, but there's so much changes in all those systems that they have no plans at the moment to change their VT determination in any of these SAP applications. You see, in the 80s, we had native SAP. We are still working also with native SAP VT determination. But you also saw a couple of attempts from SAP to actually improve that VT determination solution. One of them was the SAP transaction tax engine. And also one of them that they started, I think, 3-4 years ago, was the SAP tax service. But all those initiatives are basically stopped. We still have native SAP. There's still a possibility with the transaction tax engine, but the tax service is completely stopped by SAP, and SAP doesn't really have anything in the budget to really change their VT determination process in the SAP system. Their vision is a little bit different. So if we look at the next slide, then we see what kind of a vision SAP is developing and why that vision is being developed. So a lot of companies are now moving to the S/4HANA system. We know that we come to an end of maintenance of the old SAP ECC systems and so on. So everybody needs to move to S/4HANA. And if you look at SAP, if they would update their S/4HANA system with a correct VT determination, which also fits the gaps for all the complex VT determination flows that we see nowadays in the SAP system, then SAP is not yet there. And also within businesses, you see that they struggle with the same issues, because a lot of purchase departments say, yeah, that's nice that you have a purchasing functionality in the S/4HANA system, but we would like to have a far more sophisticated purchasing process, a real end-to-end purchasing process. So they are connecting, for example, SAP Ariba or a Coupa system or any other purchasing platform. You see that in the sales area also. We see billing apps coming. We see an e-commerce platform being created, etc. We have Concur application, and also with other applications like maybe an Oracle, or maybe you also have Microsoft Dynamics in your system, or own built legacy systems, or maybe you're buying other companies and merging with them, and you also then inheriting other legacy systems or ERP systems into your landscape. Then it becomes quite difficult to build a VT solution in all of these systems. And not only building it, so building would be a one-time effort, but also to maintain all those solutions in all those systems would be quite a big job, and a challenge also for tax managers, because you then need to understand how is my tax handled in the S/4HANA system, but how is my tax then also handled in Ariba, and maybe we also have a web, an e-commerce platform where we need to handle VAT. We might have a Concur, we might have a Microsoft Dynamics, etc. So as a VAT manager, you all of a sudden need to understand in all those systems how VAT is being treated. The same issue SAP has, because SAP also doesn't want to update their S/4HANA system. They don't want to update their Ariba and all the other platforms that they own. So SAP has basically developed a new strategy. They are going to use the SAP Cloud Platform integration with iFlows to connect in future to tax engines like the Vertex tax engine to get everything centralized in one place for your tax determination. So also as a VAT manager, you would benefit from that, I think, because then you have only one platform where you really have to look into to see how your VAT is being determined in the SPs, in these systems, so that you don't have to understand all those systems.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. So we're gonna, I think it's really good insight into the SAP and some of its limitations as well. But we want to hear from the audience again when it comes to tax transformation. And what do you actually think is then the most sustainable approach to tax transformation? I know we've touched on some of these, but do you think is it going to be more people to solve this problem? Do you think it'll come down to optimization and standardization of the tax and finance processes? Do you think the most sustainable option is to outsource tax activity, like returns preparation? Do you think the most sustainable option is to automate tax processes by tax engines or RPA? Or do you think it'll come down to centralizing tax activities, for example, in shared services centers and centers of excellence, like we discussed? So again, we're just asking you to select one. So again, which do you think is the most sustainable? More people, optimization, outsourcing, automation, or centralization? Great to see lots of you voting. It looks like some of you are maybe changing your mind between the responses, but I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and the results are coming up on the screen now. So when it comes to what you think is the most sustainable approach to tax transformation, 50% of you say it comes down to automating the processes, for example, by tax engine or RPA, which I think based on what we've discussed here makes a lot of sense. And that's closely followed at 38% by optimization. So when it comes to most sustainable option, it seems to be automating and optimizing. Just 6% said it's come down to centralizing or more people, and nobody said the most sustainable option is to outsource. So I think there's really interesting results there. And with that, I think that leads us nicely into our next topic, which I'd like to turn to the panel. And that's about whether you think there actually is such a thing as a best-in-class VAT function, and what you think, if it's not at least best-in-class, a high-quality one would look like. So Jenny, I'd just like to bring in you here for your opinion. Do you think there is such a thing as best in class VAT function?
Short answer, no. To me, it seems like the wrong question, because you know what you should be focused on is what does your business need. So you know, best for your business is going to be different from my business, will be different from yours or you know somebody else's. So you know, there might be some common factors, but actually you need to think about what does your business need, how does that relate to your you know, your business goals, your risk appetite, and so on. So so you know, it is a very nuanced thing, and you there's no getting away from thinking about what is it that your organization needs. But there are some you know things that are I guess important, whatever there. And it was very interesting actually, the poll results, and it made me smile about outsourcing, because you know, outsourcing is a way of you know, achieving certain aims and goals, but it's never going to be the thing that fixes the fundamentals that we've been talking about you know already. So actually, as part of your VAT function, you do need to be thinking about, have I got the skill sets and the focus on the things that will fundamentally drive accuracy in my VAT reporting and the data that I hold around that. So you know, thinking about automation and optimization and so on, and standardization, great. But for me, the thing that was missing there was actually the focus on data, because none of the above to me matters if your data is rubbish. All you're doing is, or actually possibly increasing your risk if you're just sending through rubbish data in a touchless and automated way. So so I think, you know, that sort of thinking about the different aspects that make up how you can get your VAT right should lead you to thinking about what is needed for my VAT function to be the best for my business, never mind anybody else's. I don't know, Peter, Roger, what you think or what you've seen.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Jenny, because you already mentioned somewhere earlier during our session that it's a combination of people, systems, processes, and organization, and that's different for almost every business because your IT infrastructure is different. You mentioned risk appetite, that's different. Even processes differ per organization. Finance organizations differ. So it's difficult to say, well, okay, we have kind of a standard best-in-class tax function. And also Roger mentioned VAT requirements, they go up. So that requires, I would say that requires an investment to stay compliant as an organization. And you can do that by a couple of means, but you cannot say, well, okay, I started at the beginning with one, let's say, indirect tax person dealing with it, and the requirements go up, and as an organization you do nothing, because then you move to non-compliance. And Jenny, you also already mentioned, for example, preferably automated controls, which is for sure something, if an organization has an ambition to reduce the number of people that are involved in finance processes and even IT processes, you need to move to automation, but because that's conflicting. You cannot say, well, okay, we're going to reduce the number of people that are involved in indirect tax processes. At the same time, you want to be and you need to be compliant with the legislation globally. So your only two alternatives then are, I would say, are automation, and then also potentially outsourcing. And from the poll, I noticed that basically nobody sees tax outsourcing of, for example, returns preparation as a sustainable approach for tax transformation. And I would say you could also benefit from outsourcing. If you would say, maybe as a temporary measure, you outsource your global VAT compliance to one single service provider, this will also provide you the means to identify the issues on a global scale, and to also identify data issues, and basically get external support to drive your tax transformation for indirect tax. But whether that's a long-term sustainable solution, or whether you should deploy it as a temporary one, yeah, I don't have that magic key, and that will also probably differ per business. But it's also it's perceived as being expensive. But if you add up all the time and inefficiencies in your organization in an indirect tax process, yeah, I would you should also do the calculation and see, well, okay, can we benefit from outsourcing? But in the end, I indeed do agree with the overall conclusion, and also with your comment, Jenny. Well, okay, start automating and also focus on data.
I think it's really interesting what you've just said about outsourcing, you know, because actually that tactically that can be a very useful tool for showing the amount of things that need to be changed, and you can use it as part of your business case and in your argument with them, or not argument, you know, your discussion with leaders and so on, because typically if you want to bring your outsourcing costs into a reasonable frame, then you have to think about, well, how do I provide data to the outsource provider in a standardized way, or, you know, what feeds into their systems, and that can really help take you down a journey, and also help people see, well, actually, how couldn't we do this ourselves? So I think it's a really good tactical move, even if it's not a strategic thing. But, you know, some areas of tax, and probably not indirect, you know, actually that possibly is a strategic part of your solutioning. But I think in the indirect tax world, it's a very useful tactical tool, as you've said, Peter.
And maybe very shortly about the IT angle on this, and in the matter of time, I really keep it short now. So I'm also very often asked for the SAP system is the best-in-class solution for automating tax in the SAP systems. And that's also not just a one size fits all, because a lot of companies, and I know, Peter, you come from a very complex background, very complex company, and Jenny, you are working in a very complex environment. But there are also companies that are not that complex. So there are very often companies that just have two parties in the flow. You're either always the first party in selling, or the last party in buying goods. And then you very often just can survive with native SAP, and you're perfectly fine with that. And then you have two other solutions. Either you have a tax engine or maybe a built-in add-on. Also, that depends on your business needs. How complex are you? How easy is it for you to update the content in your system, etc., etc. So there is no one size fits all. Also from an IT perspective.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for all that input. And we're going to get on to kind of the last section of this. But before we do, we just want to check in with our audience again. The next thing we're going to be talking about is the skill sets needed in VAT teams. So we want to ask you, what do you think are some of the most important skills to have in your VAT team? Again, I know it can be difficult just to select one, but do you think it's VAT knowledge? Do you think it's ERP and IT skills, including RPA, AI, machine learning, analytics? Is it around process skills that includes tools like AlterX? Is it accounting and corporate tax knowledge, or is it something else? So again, what do you think is the most important? Is it VAT, IT, process, accounting and corporate, or is it something else? So great if we get a few more of you voting. We're at nearly 50% and only 2 options are selected, and there's one big key winner here. Okay, a few more options now. So I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and the winner here is VAT knowledge. So again, if you think it is mostly VAT knowledge that's needed in your team, and the only kind of substantial second place here is around the IT skills. So between VAT and IT, that's nearly all of you. A handful said that it's around process skills or accounting or corporate skills. So interesting to see what your thoughts there are. And with that, I'd like to go to our panel. I know we only have about just under 10 minutes left, but it'd be great to hear, Jenny, your thoughts on what do you think needs to be in the skill toolbox of indirect tax teams?
Yeah, very interesting response. And I think, I'm not surprised actually that people say VAT skills, because actually, you're a tax department. What are you there for? No one else is going to have those skills. So I do agree that is absolutely critical. I think maybe sometimes how it's applied might need to change. And I think, from my experience, both in my current organisation and in my sort of past history, I think becoming more more data savvy and more understanding of what data is telling you is an important part of that, and it kind of leads to the business partnering and influencing skills, and the ability to articulate the problem statements and the challenges and what you are trying to achieve in layman's language is probably the aspect that's sometimes needs more development, but I absolutely agree that if you don't have the indirect tax knowledge and experience, then what are you there for, really? So I think it's more about adding some of the other parts and thinking, well, how I'm not, as a tax person, going to magically change myself into a deep IT technical specialist, and why should I? I need to partner with the people that do that. And if I look at my organisation, part of the way that we structured that is reflected in my role. So I sit as a bridge between the technology, and I work very closely with my engineering counterpart for tax, we have a sort of 2 in a box context, but I also work very closely with the rest of the tax function. So it's not necessarily about expecting the rest of the indirect tax team to have the same knowledge and experience as I have, or members of my team do, but making sure that you have that spread in your organisation, in what are the right places in your organisation. But I think, the thing that for me really needs to be there is people's ability to speak other people's languages, so we can understand each other.
I fully agree with that, Jenny, and you see that very often that is really a skill set that is missing. I always say we all speak a different language. Peter, for example, is a lawyer from a background. He speaks in articles and so on, and he loves to have the EU directives explained in a legal way. But then if you need to implement that in an IT system, then you need to all of a sudden speak with an SP consultant, a functional consultant, who then also needs to understand what those legal requirements are. And that's very difficult to explain. because you come from a completely different background. And that is what is very often missing, a bridging function that can actually explain that. So you see on the screen, if a VT manager talks with an SAP consultant, then they very often see that there is a completely different understanding of the requirements. And then that SAP functional consultant needs to explain it then to an SAP developer. And that developer, again, is a real techie, I always say, a real IT guy that really thinks in coding. So that functional consultant tries to then explain that misunderstanding or partly understanding of the rules to the developer. He, again, gets a completely different understanding about the requirements, builds something, and then once it is built, then we give that to the key user. And the key user then understands, again, something different and what has been built. And we see that very often, that if you look at the requirement and what is actually built, and I'll give you one example. I saw with one company, they said we have built an automated triangulation. And the only thing that we were checking were if there were 3 parties in the flow. They didn't check if there were different countries in the flow, and didn't check if there were other requirements. It was just 3 parties in the flow. That's triangulation, and that is how we automate that. And that was the understanding of the IT department, where I'm pretty sure that the VT manager has explained it differently than what was actually built in the system. And that's really an important function in the whole automation, to have a bridging function that people speak the both languages so that they really can express what is needed in the systems.
Yeah, and I agree with you both. And but I even feel that the challenge is even broader. And I agree with you, Jenny. If you're a tax person, you're a tax person, and you should keep your eye open for let's say for developments and also the technical and IT aspects, and you should learn that language so that we can bridge the gap with what Roger is talking about. But the difficulty here that I see for tax managers and also indirect tax managers also in the future is that Roger referred to, let's say, the language challenge with respect to ERP and ERP implementations. But you now also have, let's say, developments like machine learning, artificial intelligence, robotics, blockchain. And also tax administrations are looking into those technologies, linking networks together. And this is a picture from an OECD report about tax administration 3.0. It's really looking at where are they heading and what do they see from a data exchange perspective. And the challenge here really is to what extent, as a tax manager, do you need to know or do you need to understand all of these new technologies? I recently was in a webinar with a colleague of us in another multinational, and he actually followed a course in Python coding in order to understand what's happening there. So he really dived into coding. So what is expected? What do we need? What's your vision, Jenny?
I think we've got about 1 minute to go. Yeah. So if we can maybe just wrap up with your final thoughts, Jenny, on this, that'd be great. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, Peter. There is so much more that people need to become aware of and to add into their skill set, even if they're not deep technical specialists. But a lot of it is about teamwork and identifying those people who can help you.
Great. Well, I think we are just nearing the hour. So I think we will just have to leave it there. If you do have any questions that you want to follow up with the team and our expert panelists on the call, you can just respond to the email that you get as well, and we can make sure that gets to Team Vertex, or I'm sure Jenny would have to get back as well. So I'd just like to take a moment. Thank you, all our expert speakers. It's been lovely working with you on all the rehearsals, and I always learn so much when I speak to you. So I just want to say thank you so much, Jenny, Peter, Roger. And thank you everyone on the line. You've all been great. It's been great to see you on the poll questions. I know I can't see you, but I do feel that you're there. So thank you so much for tuning in. We really love to have you on these, and we look forward to welcoming you next time. So thank you everyone, and goodbye.